Good morning. We begin by thanking our sponsors, the TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month, Yanky and Aliza Statman, and Yitzy and Rebecca Statman, in commemoration of the first yarzheit of Menucha Shaindl Yehudis, Bas, Dovid Yosef, and Nishmas should have an Aliyah, and the family in a Chama. As well, Shmuel and Robyn Korobkin, in commemoration of the 25th yarzheit of Robyn's mother, Melanie Solomon, Allah Shalom, Pessa Mira, Bas, Chaim, and Nishmas should have an Aliyah, and the family a continuing nechama. The week of learning is sponsored by Zevi Shoshy Daniel, nishmas Refoel Yaakov ben Avraham, and Jeff and Debbie Schwartz in commemoration of the 5th yarzheit of Debbie's mother, Shulamit Bas Shmuel. The nishmas should have an aliyah, and the family should have a nechama. And we begin. Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel in Maseches Nedarim. We are going to go back a little bit, because my understanding is that the Rav ended in the middle of a Gemara on the topic of Gimel and Aleph. So just to get some context for what we're discussing, I'm going to go back to Daf Yud Beis, Amud Beis, about 5 lines up from the bottom. The Gemara is discussing this concept of when a person is using hatfasa. Hatfasa is the type of neder where a person makes something asur by association. In other words, a person points to something which is asur, and we're going to see it has to be asur because of a neder, and because of that thing being asur, he wants to associate something which is mutter and use the concept of neder to forbid himself from benefiting from that other thing. So we have all different types of examples of how a person can use the association of one item to the next to be able to create an isur. Now, the discussion we're having over here is, if you have an item which goes on and off, in other words, sometimes it's going to be asur, other times it's going to be mutter. So we have its ikar and its hetera. When a person uses hatfasa, a person uses this concept of association, he associates the davar ha-mutter with this davar ha-asur, but the davar ha-asur, the forbidden item, has periods of time when it's mutter, when it's permissible, and periods of time when it is when it is asur. So it goes back and forth. Do we go after the ikar or do we go after the hetera? So the Gemara says, Lemeka Tanai, let us suggest that this is a machlekes Tanaim. What's the example? Harei alai kibachar. The person says that a piece of meat should be upon me like a bechar. Rabbi Yaakov Oser. Yaakov says the person may not eat the piece of meat. Rabbi Yehuda says it's going to be permissible. The Gemara asks, Hechidami, what is the case that we're talking about? If we're going to say this is talking about before the zrikas damim, so my time of demand shari. If it's before zrikas damim, that's a classic example of a bechar which is asur. So therefore, what would be the reason why anybody would be matir it? Vila achar zrikas damim. If we're talking about a bechar which is already after zrikas damim, so it's permissible to be eaten, my time of demand asur. What is going to be the reason for Rabbi Yaakov, who says that his neder works and it's forbidden for him to eat the meat? The Gemara says, Elolav, it must be demachis basar bechar umachis basar deheich. He has both pieces of meat over there. Machis basar deheich kapei. He has the other piece of meat there. Amar zeh kazeh. He wasn't clear. He just said this should be like that. And our machlokes over here is exactly what we're talking about. V'tanahi. And we have the machlokes Tanaim. Do we go after the ikar, that this is the bechar, and the bechar is something which is asur, or do we not go after the ikar, but we can go after the period of time which is mutter, which would be lachar zrikas damim, and therefore be permissible for him to eat the meat, and his neder would not work. The Gemara says, "Light, that's not true. This machlokes has nothing to do with the karo kamatvis or be'atero kamatvis. This has nothing to do with whether we associate his words with the ikar, with the primary source of the carbon, which is that it is a bechar. It has nothing to do with whether we go after the period of heter, the permissible period of time, which is after zrikas damim. Rather, the kuli alma lefnei zrikas damim. We're talking about lefnei zrikas damim, and it's asur. Umay taima demand shari. Why do we have an opinion over here in the Gemara, which is Rabbi Yehuda? That happens to be this another girsa. If you look at the side, the previous Amud, that it might not be Rabbi Yehuda, could be Rabbi Yossi. But either way, It's Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi. One of them says that the neder doesn't work. He explains, Amar Kra ki yidar ad sheyador bedavar hanador lafuke bechar bedavar ha'asarhu. Since we are talking about vows over here, a person making a neder, when a person associates a davar hamotar, which is a slab of meat, a piece of meat, which is permissible to be eaten, he wants to make that piece of meat asr by association, he needs to use something which is going to be forbidden by way of a neder. A normal carbon could become asr by way of a neder, because a person looks at an animal, which is a permissible animal, and he says, my piece of meat should be like this carbon. That carbon is asr because he verbalized that he wants to be makdish that animal. But a bachar is not something which is asr because of the fact that because of a neder, it's because it's asr, it's born that way, it's born a bachar. So therefore, that's why we have the opinion over here of Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Yehuda, whoever it is in the Gemara, who says it's not a valid neder. And the reason for that is because a bachar is something which is not a davar hanador, it's not going to be prohibited because of any vow that was made, it's asr because naturally it's born that way, it's a davar ha'asr. Uman da asr, how about the one who says that it's going to be a valid neder, Rabbi Yaakov? Amar kra lashem, Gemara says, the pasuk says, ish ki yidar neder lashem, a person who will take upon himself a neder lashem. So l'rabos, the extra word la Hashem, l'rabos davar ha'asr. He says this is an exception. La Hashem says that a bachar or a davar ha'asr can be used in the context of hatfasa, of association for a neder, and therefore it would work. The Gemara says, if we're ultimately debating how to learn the pasuk in the Torah, so we're no longer using svar over here. We're coming from the psukim. Now we're stuck. We have to try to help everybody fit their own logic into the pasuk. So now we have to be able to come back to the Manda Amar, to the one who says that ultimately the neder is not going to work. Sir, the pasuk says Lashem. If it says Lashem, how do you get out of that? So my Avraham, Gemara says Mi boile lematfis bechatos va'asham. He uses Lashem to include a case where a person did hatfasa with a chatos and an asham. So the Gemara says, hold on. Uma royes the rabos chatos va'asham ulahotzi etzebachar. For what reason do you feel that you should choose one over the other? What makes you feel more strongly about including chatos va'asham over a bechar? In other words, what tells you? Very good. You found something else to associate Lashem for, but why? The Gemara says, "Marba ani chatos va'asham shu matvis beneder." He would rather use chatos va'asham. Why? Because the way that the chatos and asham become a chatos and asham is by going to the animal and choosing it. I'm going to exclude bechar because bechar is born that way. Now this is actually clear in the Ran, the Pirush Rosh on the side says that the Tosfos says this, that even though a chatos and asham is not something that a person brings just because they woke up one day and say, you know what, I want to make an neder and bring a chatos. Person brings a chatos or an asham because they did something wrong. So they have a chiyuv to bring the chatos for asham. However, the specific animal that you're choosing to bring as your chatos and asham, both karbanos, sacrifices that are brought when a person sins, the specific animal that you're bringing as your sacrifice is an animal that you choose. Whereas a bechar is not an animal you choose. A bechar is born as a bechar. You can't choose which animal you want to make into a bechar. Uman da'atzar, the one who says that the neder actually works, bechar nami matfiso benederhu, his logic is that a bechar, you could also actually be matfis it beneder. What does he mean by that? The Tanya, for it says in the Brisa, mishum Rebbe amru minayin linolad bechar b'soch beso. How do we know that if a person has a bechar animal born within his house, shem mitzvah laktisho, there's a mitzvah for him to actually go to the bechar and to be makdish it, shenemar, for it says in the pasuk, hazachar taktish. The pasuk adds in an extra word of taktish. So in other words, even though the Gemara is going to say this very clearly, we don't need him. we don't need this person to be makdish the bechar. The bechar is born as a firstborn child, a firstborn animal. Its nature is that it's a bechar, and the fact that it's a bechar, that it's born first, already makes it kadosh. However, we still have that there's a concept of neder for a bechar. Why? Because there's a special mitzvah to go to your bechar and to add kedusha, to point to the kedusha of it, and therefore there still is ultimately some element of neder involved in bechar. The Gemara says, "Uman deshari," the one who says it's not a valid term to use for atfasa, for association of a neder, because kilo makdish le milo makdish. In other words, it's very nice that a person could have like a hosafas kedusha over here. The person could add some kedusha to something which was already kadosh. He could add some form of sanctity to this bechar. However, the one who says that this is not a valid neder says at the end of the day, if you don't add the kedusha to it, it still works. So ultimately, what we have over here is we have a machlokes whether when a person uses hatfasa, a person associates a davar hamuter, something which is permissible, with a davar ha'asur, and that davar ha'asur has periods of time when it's muter and periods of time when it's asur. For example, a bechar, before zrika, it's asur, zrika, meaning spraying its blood on the mizbeach. Before that period of time, it's going to be asur. After the zrika stanim, after spraying its blood on the mizbeach, becomes permissible. We don't have a clear answer in the Gemara whether we go basar ikaro, ubasar, or do we go after the heter? Do we go after the ikar, that a bechar is something which is asur, or do we go after the period of time when it's mutter? And therefore, that leaves us with machlokas harishonim. If you look at the Ran, on the left side of your page, the last wide line before it starts getting narrow, he writes, Inyan halacha. When it comes to halacha, kasav haramban, pilchosav d'nehi, bayin hachalo ifshita. Even though our Gemara didn't answer it over here, nevertheless, ibi karo kamatvis, obetero kamatvis, is he going after the primary name of this carbon, which is Isser, or do we go after the period of time when it is mutter? Naktinan debehetera kamatis. He quotes the Ramban, and he quotes other places where it seems clear we go after the heter. Not all Rishonim agree with this. So again, the Gemara leaves us without an answer to the question, but ultimately the Rishonim deal with it. Okay, the Gemara continues. If you go back to the Mishnah said, and gave a number of examples. Mishnah Daf Yudam Beis said, Ke'imra, Ke'dirim, Ke'etzim, Ke'ishim, Ke'mizbeach, Ke'hechel, Ke'Yerushalayim. Person uses all these different terms. The Gemara is now going to analyze that. Ke'imra, Ke'dirim. Tana, we learned in a Brisa. Imra, Le'imra, Ke'imra. 3 different terms to describe the sheep. Dirim, Lidirim, Kidirim. Again, these are the corrals, the pens where you would keep the animals which are designated for karbanos. Eitzim, la'eitzim, ka'eitzim. This refers to the wood that's used on the mizbeach. So again, any one of these terms to describe that his piece of meat that he's talking about should be like any one of these. Ishim, li'ishim, ki'ishim. Like the fire of the mizbeach. Mizbeach, la mizbeach, kimizbeach, heichal, la heichal, ka heichal, Yerushalayim, la Yerushalayim, ki Yerushalayim. In other words, in any one of these expressions over here that a person uses, the Brisa says, kulan, in any one of these cases, if he says, sha'eichalach, in other words, that which I am eating should be like any one of these previous examples, and he expresses it in any of the above mentioned fashions, halacha is, his neder works, and the meat that he's talking about becomes asur. If he says, loy eichalach, to what I am not eating, mutter. Then it's mutter. In other words, that's like, what he means is, what I am not eating will be like that. In other words, there's an inference over here. In such a case, the Brisa says, it's not going to work. So man, shaminan le, doloshani le, imra le imra ke imra. Who's the one who does not make a difference between any of these expressions of whether he said imra, the sheep, which is the carbon tamid, li imra, to the imra, ki imra, like the imra, Who's the one who ultimately does not differ between any of these terms? Rabbi Meir. The Gemara says it is Rabbi Meir. Now the problem is that we don't have this Rabbi Meir anywhere. So if you look in the Pirush Harash, I believe it's in the Mefarish also in Rashi, that Rabbi Meir doesn't really say this. We just assume, if you look at the Loshani Le Imra Rabbi Meir, the Mistama Bar Plukta Rabbi Yehuda Masnisan Hu Rabbi Meir. The Pirush Harash on the side says, even though we don't have any explicit place where Rabbi Meir says that he does not differ between any of these terms, Rabbi Yehuda does make a difference. Yehuda in the Mishnah does say that there's a difference between the way that you express it. So we're assuming that the one who differs is going to be Rabbi Meir because Rabbi Meir is the normal bar plukta, a normal one to disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. Now the problem with that is, if it's Rabbi Meir, Ema Seifa, let's go farther in the Mishnah. V'kulon lo ochalach. In all of these cases, if he says, lo ochalach, that I'm not eating it, mutter. It's mutter. V'atnan. However, we have a problem. We learned in the Mishnah, la karban lo ochalach, Rameir oser. Rameir says that if you use the term lo ochalach, that I'm not going to eat it, then it does work. In other words, the neder does work. So that brisa, it's very nice that the first part fits, but the second part doesn't. Rabbi Abba explains that it's nasa ka'omar la karban yehei. It's as if he said la karban yehei, and therefore the term lo ochalach is lefikach lo ochalach. In other words, we're missing a lot of words over here, but when he says lo ochalach, we understand what he meant to say is this should be like a karban, and therefore I'm not eating it. But that's not consistent with the brisa. Gemara says lo kasha had amar lo imra, leave out the lamed. That's the way the Bach does it. Lo imra had amar la imra. In other words, we're getting very technical on how it was said. If he said lo imra, then in such a case it's not like the imra, and the neder doesn't work. If he said li imra, that's where he's actually comparing it to the sheep, and the neder will work. In other words, so there's a very, very distinct difference between the lo imra and la imra. Again, there seems to be some lack of clarity in terms of what the Gemara meant to say here. That's why it says lo li imra, had amar li imra. It doesn't really make sense to say that because it's adding in a whole word. So therefore, the Gemara gets in this nuanced difference, which is lo imra. In other words, it could sound like li imra, which is lo imra. And the other way of understanding it is li imra. Now, if you look in both the Ran and the Rush and Tosfos, they all bring down that it's possible that what the Gemara meant to say is that it just depends which nekudas you're using. Is it li imra or la imra? But again, there's a lack of clarity in how it works, but the bottom line is that there's a difference. There's a difference between the Bryce and the Mishnah, whether he said lo imra or he said la imra or li imra. All right, we'll continue with the next Mishnah. Ha'omer, karban, ola, mincha, chatas, toda, shlamim. He gives any example of one of these karbanos. So we know an ola is a carbon which is completely burned. A mincha is a meal offering. Chatas is the carbon which comes for an aver that a person committed b'shogeg. A toda is a thanksgiving carbon. A shlamim is a person just brings a carbon shlamim. Again, he's shalem with a Kadosh Baruch Hu. He wants to go bring a carbon shlamim. Now he uses any of these examples, and he says sha'ani ochalach. In other words, that which I am eating should be like any one of these above mentioned examples. Aser. The neder works, and now he cannot eat that food that he is associating to it. Rabbi Yehuda Matir, Rabbi Yehuda says it's mutter. Now ha-carbon, kick-carbon, carbon. He uses any one of those terms, which are ha-carbon, kick-carbon, carbon. In other words, he's associating meat, which is mutter, with a carbon, with a sacrifice. Halach is she'ochalach. If he says she'ochalach, it's going to be aser. La carbon lo ochalach. If he says La carbon, to a carbon, lo achalach, I will not eat it. Remeir oser, Remeir says it's aser. The Gemara says, katani, skip the first word after that, which is carbon, because it's not what it says. So therefore, skip the first word. The Bach takes out the first word, carbon. Katani, we learned in the Mishnah, ha carbon, ki carbon. We learned, ha carbon, ki carbon, she'ochalach, that I will eat, aser. So stama tanek Rabbi Meir. The Stam Mishnah learns like Rabbi Meir, to lo shani le'bein imra le'imra. He doesn't make a difference between whether you said imra or le'imra. In other words, he does not distinguish between the specific language of imra or le'imra. Gemara says, Rabbi Meir, if it's going to be Rabbi Meir, who is the Tana of this Mishnah, hadik tani ha carbon she'ochalach aser, but it says, ha carbon she'ochalach is going to be aser. If a person uses that term, that the food is talking about, she'ochalach, that he plans to eat, should be ha carbon, then it's going to be aser, the neder is going to work. But Tanya, the problem is, we learned in the Brisa, modim chachamim Rabbi Yehuda, chachamim agreed to Rabbi Yehuda, va'omar ha carbon, v'ha ola, v'ha mincha, v'ha chatas, she'ochalach shemuter, shlo nodar zeh elo v'chai carbon. The problem is, it says very clearly that when a person uses those terms of ha carbon or ola, ha mincha, chatas, all he's saying is that what I'm eating should be like the life of a carbon, which is not a valid expression of a neder. So we see that it doesn't work. So how are we going to make this Reb Meir, where it says lo kasha, there's no kasha, ha amar ha carbon. One of them is talking about when he said ha carbon, ha amar ha carbon. And the other ones where he said ha carbon. If you look at the Ran, lo kasha ha amar ha carbon, ha amar ha carbon, kalamar. The chi amar ha carbon, when he says ha carbon, hai lahavi ka carbon ka amar. This one should be like a carbon. It's different than saying ha carbon, that this is a carbon, which is not a valid expression of a neder, because again, that's just like saying that this should be like the life of the carbon. Okay. My timer, the Gemara explains, my timer, what's the reason? Chai carbon ka'amar, he's simply just saying it is chai carbon. Katani la carbon lo ochalach. We learned in the Mishnah that if a person says la carbon lo ochalach, I will not eat it, Rameir oser, Rameir says it's a valid neder. The problem is, we learned earlier that Reb Meir is the one who says that he goes with the concept of the neder of Ketnai Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain. This was Shabbos' daf, where according to Reb Meir, you have to say everything. You have to be explicit about every aspect of whatever your expression is, whether it's a neder or it's a Tanai. You have to go ahead and express both sides. We don't make inferences. We're not going to go ahead and hear your words and say, if you said this, then you meant that. The problem over here is, when it says, Katani la carbon lo ochalach, in other words, what I will not eat will be la carbon. If you look at the Mefarish and Rashi, which means aval she'ochalach, what I will eat, havik carbon. In other words, you have to stretch his words. When he says lo ochalach, what I am not eating, so then you have to go ahead and interpret his words to say what I am eating, she'ochalach havik carbon, will be like a carbon. Now, why is it that Reb Meir says that that's a valid expression of a neder? Reb Meir does not hold michlal lav ata shemei hein. Reb Meir does not use the inference of saying what I said no about is no, but the opposite of that's going to be true. In other words, what I will not eat will be like a carbon, but what I will eat. In other words, you have to go ahead and pull that out of what he left out of his words. Rabbi Abba explains, and we've used this before as well. It's as if the person said, La carbon yehei, lefikach lo ochalach. In other words, even though, this is a little bit of a difficult thing to understand, because the logic of Reb Meir is that you have to express exactly what you're thinking. So if you only say the no, then we're not going to pull the yes out of your words. So in other words, if a person says, I'm not going to walk on the other side of the street, we don't automatically say, well, that means he will walk on this side of the street. Because what you said is what you said, what you didn't say is what you didn't say. The concept of Rabbi Abba is that sometimes an expression that a person says includes what he means to say. So when a person adds in the word karban, and he says lo ochalach, what he means to say is he just was missing part of his statement, and therefore, nase ka'omar, it's as if he said, la karban gehei, this piece of meat should be like a karban, lefikach lo ochalach, and therefore I'm not going to eat it. We'll continue with the next Mishnah. Omer lechavero. A person says to his friend, konam, which is an expression of a vow, pi medaber imcha. In other words, I'm making a vow on my mouth not to talk to you. Yadai osa imcha. My hands from doing anything with you. In other words, I'm not going to do business with you. I'm not going to work with you. Ragli mahalaches imcha. He makes a neder of either konem pi medaber imcha, a neder on my mouth to speak to you, or my hands to do work with you, or my feet to walk with you, says the Mishnah, aser. That's a valid expression of a neder, and therefore the person would not be able to speak to the other person, you would not be able to do business with the other person, you would not be able to walk with the person. The Gemara asks, V'raminu, this is a stira. Why? Because we learned, and this goes back to the very first Amud of Maseches Nedarim, that there's a difference between a neder and a shvua. And part of the differences are that we have certain stringencies that apply to nedarim that don't apply to shvuos, and we have certain stringencies that apply to shvuos that don't apply to nedarim. Chomer b'shvuos mi b'nedarim. A shvua is more chomor than a neder, u'b'nedarim mi shvuos. And there are some stringencies on nedarim than shvuos. What's an example? Chomer b'nedarim. A neder is more chamor, is more stringent. Shanadarim chalam ala mitzvah kirbereshus. A neder is chal. A neder can ultimately take effect on a mitzvah like a reshus. A person can make a neder that he won't fulfill a mitzvah. Mashein came b'shvuas. A shvua cannot work that way. Why? Because the mechanics of a neder. If you look at Rashi in the Mefarish, so he actually says it later on Davar Shem B'Mamish. But remember, when it comes to a neder, different than a shvua, if you turn back to the very first Amud, nedarim is the mitzar chefza. A neder is when a person asers an object upon himself. A person forbids the object upon himself. A shvua is where a person the ka'asar nafshe min hachefza. When a person asers himself upon that chefza. So now when it comes to a neder, since he's talking about the object, a person can't aser himself from going into a sukkah, because he's not talking about himself. When it comes to a shvua, a person cannot take a shvua, cannot take an oath upon himself not to fulfill a mitzvah, because he's already mushba va'omed, his nefesh, his soul, is already committed to kiyam mitzvos, and therefore a neder cannot go ahead and, a shvua cannot go ahead and undo that. So chomer b'nedarim shenedarim chalam ala mitzvahs kebereshus. A neder is chal on a mitzvah. It takes effect on a mitzvah, just like a reshus, like any other voluntary item. Masha'en kein b'shvuos. A shvua cannot work on a mitzvah. V'chomer b'shvuos. There is a stringency by shvuos. Shashvuos chalos al davar shein b'mamish. A shvua can be chal on a davar shein b'mamish, on something which doesn't have any. It's not tangible. V'shein b'mamish. Sorry, a davar sheyesh b'mamish is something which is tangible. V'shein b'mamish is something which is not tangible. Masha'en kein b'nedarim. Unlike a neder. In other words, a person can take a shvua that he won't go to sleep. Even though sleep is not something which is tangible, but the shvua is on himself. A person cannot take a neder that he won't go to sleep, because you can't have a neder take effect on a davar she'ein bo mamash, or something which is not tangible. What's the problem? The problem is, in these cases, we're talking about talking. Is speech a davar she'ein bo mamash? No. So how could a person take a neder, konim pi medaber imcha? that I'm not going to speak with you. So Amar Rab Yehuda says, "Ba'omer ye'aser pi l'diburi." He's in other words, what he means to say when it comes to a neder is he's ostering his mouth, his physical mouth, from speaking. Yodai l'maseyeh, my hand to the work. Ragli l'hiluchan, so it becomes a davar sheyesh bo mamish. His mouth exists, his hands exist, his feet exist, and therefore the neder can take effect on his mouth. Gemara says, "Dekanami." It actually makes sense that that's what it's talking about, the Katani, where it says in the Mishnah, Pi medaberimcha, my mouth. The Mishnah was careful to express that it was talking about the mouth, not simply to talk about the speech. V'lo Katani sha'ani medaberimcha. It doesn't say that I am going to speak with you, so it's very clear that it's talking about his mouth. Hadron alach kol kinuye. With this, we conclude the first parak. Now, I'll just share with you, Mr. Shem will still start the next Mishnah today. But I saw in the Sefer Chashukei Chemed, it's a fascinating Sefer for Rav Zilberstein, where he takes sometimes what you would assume to be a very dry Yamad of Gemara, and he finds some very fascinating discussions. So he has a very long discussion over here on the. So we said that a difference between a neder and a shvua is whether a person can apply it to a dvar mitzvah. So we know that a neder can be applied to a dvar mitzvah, and therefore, if the person says he's taking a neder not to eat in the sukkah, so he has to be mater neder. And if he's not mater neder, he violates the isser of lo yachal dvaro, because he took a neder, and therefore the neder was chal. The neder took effect, and he would be in violation of his neder if he eats in the sukkah. But not so with a shvua. When it comes to a shvua, a person cannot take a shvua about a dvar mitzvah, because a person's whole essence is already. It's already meshubad, it's already committed to kiyum mitzvos, and therefore a person cannot take a shavua not to fulfill a mitzvah. So he asks a question: what happens if a person takes a shavua? He uses the lashon of a shavua not to fulfill a mitzvah, but it's a specific mitzvah which is not relevant to him at this point in time. The example is benching. A person does not have a standing chiyuv, does not have a standing obligation to say Birkas Hamazon. You only have a chiyuv to say Birkas Hamazon if you eat bread. If you'll never eat bread in your life, you'll never be obligated to say Birkas Hamazon. So this is unlike the mitzvah of sukkah or achilas matzah, where it's not relevant every day of the year. I don't have a mitzvah today to eat in the sukkah, but I do have a mitzvah today that if it was sukkahs, I would eat in the sukkah. In other words, it happens to be I'm standing on the wrong calendar day to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah, or to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav, or to fulfill the mitzvah of achilas matzah, but it's just as relevant today as it is on the day of sukkahs. However, a person could completely absolve themselves from the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon by never eating bread. So what happens if a person takes a shavua not to say Birkas Hamazon? Or what happens if a person takes a shavua not to put tzitzis on his beged? Again, we know that a person technically is never obligated to wear a pair of tzitzis. If you wear a beged shadalat kanfos, if you wear a beged that has four corners, you have to put on tzitzis. Now, the way the Torah writes this, and it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch, is that it's tov and nachon that a person should be mahader to always get himself a pair of tzitzis, and that's how we're knowing. A person should always put on a pair of tzitzis every single day and should wear them as long as possible. It's tov and nachon. It's not only the proper thing to do, it's a good thing to do. But again, a person technically can absolve themselves from the mitzvah of wearing tzitzis by never buying a beged shadal kanfos. He goes on, he has a lengthy discussion. He brings a raya from an interesting halacha in Shulchan Aruch. In Shulchan Aruch, in Choshen Mishpat Siman Ayin Gimel Sefhei, the Mechaber quotes the Rosh, where he says, Ruve nishba shalo limkar mishalo lefroa shumchov. A person takes upon himself a shvua, I'm never going to sell any of my assets to pay back any loans that I owe. V'achar kach nishba lefroa l'shimon l'zman ploni. He takes a shvua about paying Shimon back for a certain period of time. When that time period comes, he says he has no money. So the in Shulchan Aruch Paskin says as follows: Im chov shima kadam l'shvua shalo limkar mishalo lochala hashvua. Again, what's the case? A person takes a shvua not to sell any of his assets to pay back loans that he owes. What's the halacha? If he already owes money at that point in time, then the shvua doesn't work. Why? Because it's too late. You owe the money. Vim hashvua kadma l'chov shima. If his shvua happened before Shimon's loan was initiated, nimtzas hashniya shvua shav. The second one is the shvua shav. Umakin Allah makas mardis. V'mitoch emas hamakas yicharet v'yimtza pesach l'shvua rishona yetiru lo v'yimka v'yikayim shvua shniya. In other words, the bottom line is the shvua will take effect if he made the shvua before he borrowed the money. So this seems to be a very similar case. A person takes a shvua not to sell his assets in order to pay back a loan that he owes. If he took the shvua before he borrowed the money, so then the shvua works, because he doesn't owe the money yet. But if he took the shvua after he borrowed the money, what right do you have to take that shvua? You already have a mitzvah to pay back. So we see clearly that a person's shvua can take effect before he finds himself within the realm of that obligation. He goes on with a lot of proof back and forth, and he gives a number of different examples. He writes at the end, "L'chein lamaisa nira shekasha nishpa shelo levarach berkas hamazon hashvua lo chala." He says it's not going to work. He has a number of examples, but the bottom line is, part of it has to do with the fact that a person really can't absolve themselves unless they're an ones from berkas hamazon, because on Shabbos he has a mitzvah to eat bread, on Yom Tov he has a mitzvah to eat bread, a number of other times on Sukkot, on Pesach a person has a chiyuv to eat bread, and therefore it's not really reasonable for a person to be able to say he's never going to have a chiyuv berkas hamazon, and therefore in other words, the logic just won't work out. But technically it seems like from its raw logic, if you can avoid ever having to fulfill a mitzvah, you could take a shvuah not to do it. Not recommended, but again, an interesting discussion about how this works. Let's start the next parak. Ve'elu mutarin. The Mishnah says the following terminology is not going to work to be able to accomplish a neder. Chulin sha'ochalach. A person says, what I will eat will be chulin. Ki b'sar chazir, like the basar of a chazir. Kavodas kachavim, like avodah zara. Ka'oros levuvin, like the skins of levuvin. We'll describe what this is soon. Kinevelos, like a nevela, v'trefos, and a trefa, kishkotzim, v'ramasim, like creepy, crawly things which are asar. Kechalas arnu k'chumaso, like the chala of Aaron and Ketshuma, all those different terminologies are not good expressions of a neder. Ha'omer le'ishto, a person says to his wife, Harei at alai ke'ima, you are to me like my mother. Whatever that means to you, you are to me like my mother. Poschin lo Pesach mimakom acher. We open up a Pesach from another place. Shlo yakel rosho lakach. What does this mean? When a person comes to be matir neder, the halacha is the first thing a beis din will say to somebody when they want to they want to null a vow. What we say to them is there something about the vow that you didn't understand when you made the neder? That's a Pesach. In other words, a person says, I took upon myself the following neder. I did not realize the extent that this neder was going to affect my life. That's considered a Pesach, but not a Pesach mimakom acher. Pesach mimakom acher is if there's other external circumstances that affect your shavua. We're going to see the reason why he has to do this. If you look in the Ran at the bottom, 4 lines from the bottom. So again, just to understand, when a person says that his wife should be like his mother, what he means to say is just like he is forbidden upon his mother, his wife will be forbidden upon him. So that's what he means to say. Now look, the Ran says, the dafka, it's 3 lines from the bottom. There's a period right before that. V'dafka b'madar ishto umat v'spedavra asar tarach pesach. Only when it comes to a person making this neder for his wife does he need to have this opening to his neder. Why? Mipnei shedarko le'asar es ishto mitoch hakpada. People sometimes get upset at their wives. Present company excluded, obviously. But sometimes people get upset at their wives. When they get upset at their wives, during a fit of rage, of anger, they say, you know something? Forget it. You should be also like me, on me like my mother. Now, the isharas below Pesach, if we're going to allow the person to go ahead and become back mutter to his wife without having some type of Pesach, some type of excuse for it, so kimat bisv'davra also the mystery nami. If he's going to use a different expression, he'll say, you know what? Chazal, I'm not really worried about Nedarim that people make between their wives and themselves. Because it was just, I was angry, I didn't really mean it. When I calmed down, I got a hold of myself, I shouldn't have said it in the first place. So therefore, a person's going to go ahead and then just be matir a real neder that he has to his wife without any Pesach. So therefore, even though in this case it's not a real expression of a neder, if a person says to his wife, you should be like my mother, but it seems like it's fairly common enough that people get upset at their wives and they say things to their wives without thinking, and they make nedarim that their wife should be usher to them. We have to be very careful about just letting it go. We have to make sure that if a person is going to express that his wife should be usher to him, even if the specific language that he used, which is, you should be like my mother, which is not a valid expression of a neder, still we require some form of hatara over here to annul the vow, because otherwise he might actually use a real expression of a neder, and then he'll say, you know what, I calmed down, I didn't really mean it, and it's fine. You know what, forget the neder. And in that case, it's really a neder. Now, let's go back to what these cases are. Chulin shochlach is chulin. Chulin means any type of chulin which is permissible. Kibsar chazir is obviously chazar. It's aser to be eaten. Now, the Mishnah is going in a progression of different levels of iser. If you look at the Ran, you have komini isurin katani, isurin ba'achila, kibsar chazir. B'sar chazir, mira v'chazar, is forbidden to be eaten. V'asurin b'hana, we have cases of isuri hana, which is not just an iser to eat it, it's an iser to benefit from it, kavod kechavim. And then we have other cases which are takrovis lavodos kechavim, which is actually, it was a service of avodah zarah, which is oros levuvin. What are oros levuvin? So, hate to ruin your appetite early in the morning. If you look at Rashi, at the Ran, he explains, Shayu nokvin ha'ar keneged alev, v'yimotziin oso keshu chai. Part of the service of avodah zarah is they would make a hole in the area of the animal where the heart is, and they would rip out the heart while it was still alive. So that was a service of avodah zarah. So this is not just avodah zarah, which is asur b'hana, but it's such bad avodah zarah that you can't even remove that avodah zarah from it. In other words, it sticks forever, and it's not replaceable. So that's called she'ein lehem batala. And then we go on to cases where there's tumas nevela, and there's also cases at the end of shkatzim v'ramasim where it is chamura even b'chadasha. It becomes tameh with such a small amount. So there's a progression of isra over here from all the way permissible, like chulin, and then going to Isuri Hana of avodah zarah, which is not replaceable, which is not fixable, and then going on to all types of tumah. All of these are not valid expressions of a neder. The only case which requires a hatara was where a person says to his wife, "Harei atalai ke'ima," you are to me like my wife. In such a case, posting lo pesach mimakom acher, person needs to ultimately nullify that vow. Why? Because these things happen occasionally where a person will express that, and if we're not going to make him be matir neder, shlo yakel rosho lakach, we don't want him to become accustomed to being very lenient with this and not taking this seriously, and therefore he has to have a hatara. We'll stop here. We'll continue tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem, with the Gemara. Have a wonderful day.